I think it's time for children's church. I think they know that. As they all run out, let me tell you how fortunate all of you are this morning, because I plan to preach not one, but 2 sermons. Okay, before you all walk out, I think I just heard Connie go, Sounded like a sarcastic, These are not 2 distinct sermons, but more like a Russian nesting doll, where one sermon fits snugly into the other. For the bigger doll, I want to address Deuteronomy chapters 4 through 7. But to do that, I want to focus on the inner doll, the sermon that Moses preaches in chapter 4. And I want for us to hear that sermon in its entirety. But before we hear it, I want to describe briefly where it fits into our larger passage this morning. We opened up Deuteronomy last week with Moses setting out to explain the law to the second generation of Israelites who were sitting on the edge of the land that God had promised them, ready to go in. These are Moses' final words to them. And last week, we focused our attention on Moses as he retold Israel's recent past. God's word always comes to us at a particular time and place. And so Moses is orienting his audience, helping them see who they have been and who God has been in spite of who they have been. The Israelites have been prepped for a sermon. No music or lighting or gimmicks to get people engaged. All he gives them is a reminder of their past unfaithfulness, a reminder of God's present work and faithfulness. And a sermon is what they get as this morning's passage opens with a sermon. This sermon is a direct message to Israel's second generation. And the sermon opens with a call to this new generation that they should listen to and that they should do the statutes and stipulations that will later be given in Deuteronomy. The sermon closes then with a call to do these same statutes and stipulations. And so, listen to and do. Open the sermon, but they also frame the sermon. Yet for all of the talk about listening and doing, the sermon is strangely empty of almost any practical advice or guidance. The sermon doesn't give us much along the lines of what we would normally consider doing. And this may surprise us as we hear the sermon, because our cultural expectations for what a sermon is and should be often lead us to listen for application. But this sermon is almost entirely focused on questions of why. Why should this new generation listen? And why should they do? In other words, this sermon is about 2 things. It is about revelation, and it's about motivation. When I say it's a sermon about revelation, I don't mean that it's about the book of Revelation that will come later in the whole of Scripture. I mean that it is a sermon about how God chooses to reveal himself to humanity. But the sermon is also about motivation. Moses never comes along and says, do so because God said so. Rather, Moses calls the people to do because God is, because God has done, and because God has said such things that he has demonstrated. He is so utterly and completely worth their attention and their obedience. Revelation and motivation, these sermon themes, then shape what follows as we read Deuteronomy chapters 5 and 6 and into 7. Chapter 5 moves beyond how God reveals himself, though it deals with that too, but begins to focus on what God reveals. Chapter 5 reminds us that at the heart of this call to listen and to obey is a God who makes covenants with human beings. And chapter 5 reveals the conditions of the covenant that God has made with Israel at Sinai. And then chapter 6 and into 7 give us some instructions on how this community is to remain motivated. How are they to go on hearing these words in the future? How are they to orient their lives around them? How are they to pass them on from generation to generation? This is the bigger egg. So let's hear Moses' sermon then. And as we hear it, I want you to listen for specific examples where Moses speaks about how God reveals himself to them. And I want you to listen for examples of what should motivate this new generation of Israelites to do what the Lord has commanded. And after I have preached the little egg, I don't know why I thought that, I will ask you to maybe share some of these thoughts quickly after that. Revelation and motivation. Listen to and do. Oh, I'm going to channel my inner Moses. Am I going to stick? No. A staff. He has a staff. I need one of those. Or a robe. Where's Pete when I need him? He had that sweet robe. Okay. And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the stipulations that I am teaching you to observe in order that you might live and enter and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving to you. You are not to add to the word that I am commanding you, and you are not to subtract from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor. Indeed, every man that walked at Baal Peor, the Lord your God destroyed them from among you. But you, the ones clinging to the Lord your God, are alive, all of you, today. See, I am teaching you statutes and stipulations as the Lord my God has commanded me, so that you will do these things in the land that you are entering to possess. You are to keep them. You are to observe them. For that will be wisdom for you and understanding for you in the eyes of the peoples who, when they hear these laws, will say, what a wise and understanding people is this great nation. For who else is such a great nation, having God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us in all our calling on him? And who else is such a great nation that has statutes and stipulations so just as all of this instruction that I put before you today? Only take care. Take exceeding care for yourself, so that you do not forget the things that your eyes saw, so that you do not turn aside in your heart all of the days of your life. Make known to your children and to your children's children how on the day that you stood before the presence of the Lord your God at Sinai, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may have them hear my words, that they may learn awe toward me. All the days that they are alive on the soil, they are to teach their children this. You all came near. You stood beneath the mountain. Now the mountain was burning with fire up to the very heart of the heavens in darkness, cloud, and fog. And the Lord spoke to you from the midst of the fire, a voice of words you heard, a form you did not see, only a voice. He announced to you his covenant, which he commanded you to observe, the 10 words, and he wrote them down on 2 tablets of stone. And me, the Lord commanded at that time to teach you laws and regulations for you to observe them in the land that you are crossing into to possess. So you are to take exceeding care for yourselves, for you did not see any form on that day that the Lord spoke to you at Sinai from the midst of the fire. Beware so that you do not bring ruin by making for yourselves a carved form of any figure in the pattern of a male or a female, the pattern of any animal that is on the earth, the pattern of a winged bird that flies in the heavens, the pattern of a crawling thing on the soil, the pattern of a fish that's in the waters beneath the earth, or so that you don't lift up your eyes to the heavens and see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the forces of heaven and be lured away to give honor to them and serve them, those whom the Lord has given for all the peoples beneath the heavens. But you, the Lord took and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be for him a people of inheritance, as it is this very day. Now, the Lord was angry with me because of your words. And he swore not to let me cross the Jordan, not to enter the good land that the Lord is giving you as an inheritance. For I am going to die in this land. I will not cross the Jordan. But you will cross over and take possession of the good land. Take care, so that you do not forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he cut with you, by making yourselves a carved image, the form of anything, about which the Lord has commanded you. For the Lord your God, he is a consuming fire, a jealous God. When you have children, and your children have children, and you grow old in the land, should you bring ruin by making a carved image in the form of anything, thus doing what is evil in the eyes of the Lord your God, provoking him? I call as witness against you today the heavens and the earth, that you will perish, yes, perish quickly. From off the land that you are crossing over there to possess, you will not live many days upon it, but you will be destroyed, yes, destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples. You will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will lead you. You will serve there gods made by human hands, of wood and of stone, which cannot see and cannot hear and cannot eat and cannot smell. But when you seek the Lord your God from there, you will find him, if you search for him with all your heart and with all your being. When you are in tribulation because these things fall on you in the late days, you shall return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. For a compassionate God is the Lord your God. He will not weaken you. He will not bring ruin on you. He will not forget his covenant that he swore to your fathers. For ask, please, of past days which were before you, from the day that God created humankind on the earth, from one edge of the heavens to the other edge of the heavens, has there ever been such a great thing, or anything heard like it? Has a people ever heard the voice of a God speaking from the midst of the fire, as you have heard yourself and remained alive? Or has a God ever attempted to come and take himself a nation from within a nation, with trials, signs, and wonders, and by acts of war, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and with great awe-inspiring acts, according to all that the Lord your God did in Egypt before your eyes? You yourself have seen, have been made to see, to know that the Lord, he is God. There is none beside him. From the heavens he had you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he had you see his great fire, and his words you heard from the midst of the fire. Now, since he loved your fathers, he chose their descendants after them and brought you out with his presence, with great power from Egypt, to dispossess nations greater and mightier from before you, by bringing you out, by bringing you their land as an inheritance, as it is this very day. Know today, and lay it up in your heart, that the Lord, he is God. in the heavens above and on the earth below. None else. You are to keep his laws and his commandments that I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, in order that you may live many days on the soil that the Lord your God is giving you all the days to come. This is the word of the Lord. Revelation and motivation. So, what did Moses say about how God has revealed himself to Israel? Not rhetorical. Yes, Jane, I feel guilty because I told her this morning that I was going to be asking this question, so I feel like I put a plant in. Jane, go.
Well, I waited a full 10 seconds before.
True.
So one thing was that they stood before God's presence and saw the fire and heard his voice. That's one way that he revealed himself to them.
Yeah, they saw the fire and heard his voice. Good, I heard Kim.
He brought them out of another nation. He did all these things for them, all these miracles.
Yeah, there were definitive actions that were seen.
Right.
Good. Yeah, giving them the commandments that there are words spoken by God that are to be heard by him. Yeah, did anybody pick up when they have been sent away and scattered into the nations? What is it that will turn them back? His voice. Good. What about motivation? Anybody pick up any pieces throughout that highlight how the Israelites are to be motivated? Or what is to motivate them?
Possession of the land.
Yeah, possession of the land. So the future that's in front of you.
Maintenance of said land.
Maintenance of said land. Maintaining, keeping it in their possession. Yeah.
It's a nicer way of saying the threat of
Yeah, there is a threat in there. Yeah, Whitney.
that they live.
That these words carry in them life somehow. Good. Yeah, Levi.
Keeping the commands of other nations with marvel.
Yeah, so your obedience to God is actually a public witness. And so when we go all the way back to Exodus 20, where we're told that Israel was to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, that their attention to God and trust and obedience somehow teaches the world who God is. Good. Thanks, man. Yeah, Sean. Yeah, they're right on that land, and that's the promise in front of them. You mentioned the plagues that they had endured in the land. That was one of the things that was named. So not only have they seen God's miraculous acts bringing them out of Egypt, but he specifically named, you saw what the Lord did to the people at Baal Peor, this plague that took out 24,000. Yeah. And as the chapters unfold in Deuteronomy, it becomes clear that is ultimately the driving impulse, the thing that ought to be there that's not, is this desire to seek God and draw near to him as an act of love. Yeah. In the chapters that follow this sermon, Moses gives the same refrain. He says, "Hear, O Israel." We hear it in chapter 5, verse 1, at the beginning of the Ten Commandments. Hear, O Israel. In chapter 6, we get it twice, first in verse 3 and then in verse 4. Hear, O Israel. What Moses has introduced in this sermon is the primary way by which God's people can know him and are given what they need for life and for relationship with him. We know God through his words. God speaks and we listen. It is clearly a little bit more complex than that. The first generation of Israelites not only heard God, but they also saw him act. They saw him perform plagues, signs, and wonders, miraculous feats, but the first generation perished because seeing is not believing. Seeing does not mean that trust will follow. Seeing was supposed to lead to listening and doing, but it didn't. Moses introduces two ways of knowing God in this sermon, seeing and hearing, but he quickly collapses these categories into hearing. Let me explain. The second generation of Israelites were not in Egypt. There was a small fraction of them who were under the age of 20 when the first generation rebelled, but the large majority of them were not in Egypt. They did not see the plagues. They did not see God part the waters. They did not see God at Mount Sinai. This generation has grown up only with these stories, these events and experiences given to them word of mouth, meaning what the first generation saw, the second generation hears. But, and this is where Moses begins to do some sort of mental gymnastics. In verse 9, Moses talks about the things that this generation has seen with their eyes. He talks about the day that they stood before God at Sinai. He describes how they drew near to the mountain, and he tells them that the Lord spoke to them, and they heard only the sounds of words, but they didn't see anything. And then in chapter 5, right before the Ten Commandments, Moses says, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Sinai. And he explicitly says, not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant. It was with our fathers, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The simple fact is that these statements from a straightforward reading of Exodus just don't add up. The most that this generation could have seen and experienced at Sinai was the inside of a womb, right? Most of them had not been born. So either Moses has finally started to lose it at the ripe age of 120, or Moses just making stuff up, which I also wouldn't be surprised about. Or Moses is saying something super, uber, ultra, really important about the way that we experience and know and follow God. I'm going to go with the third option, though I think a case could be made for the first two as well. Somewhere in the church's history, we got the idea that it is the church's job to create and recreate mountaintop experiences for ourselves and for our children. We tend not to be as interested in recreating Sinai because that one feels pretty scary. But we read the Gospels and we hear about the feeding of the 5,000. We hear about Peter walking on water and the healing of, everyone. And we look at our world and we hunger for our own feeding of the 5,000, and we want to walk on water like Peter did, or we want to be part of God healing someone. But what if the second generation of Israelites, like the second generation of Israelites, God doesn't intend the Gospels to be a list of miracles for us to sort of hope that God will reproduce for us and our children? What if he intends instead that these stories of these initial acts to be sufficient for us, to be enough to compel us to turn our ears toward God, to turn our hearts toward God, to trust his word and to obey all that he commands? When we read the feeding of the 5,000, what if we don't need to wish that God would do it over again, or that God would do it for us? But what if the Gospels help us participate in the very first feeding, so that we can grow in our trust as the disciples did, learning that Jesus is the one who miraculously fed Israel in the wilderness. And from this trust, rather than frantically searching for more signs and more experiences, we begin to act on our trust, obeying all that Jesus commanded. And so this story becomes a story that we hear and internalize, and it becomes our story, not something that we go looking to recreate, but something that we live in light of, that we respond to with faith. Even more blessed are those who, not seeing, merely hearing, still trust and obey all that the Lord commands. For Moses, speaking to a new generation collapses seeing into hearing. He says that this new generation has seen, when that's not true. They have only just heard. He can say this because if we are invested in what we are hearing, hearing is enough to make someone else's experience our own. If we care enough about the stories that are being told, we will accept them as our own stories. Preachers are often accused of taking stories from other places and passing them off convincingly as if they are their own. I've heard one preacher say that he had told one story so many times, he legitimately forgot that the story wasn't about himself. Listen to the way that you talk about your favorite stories. I am reminded of friends who have accidentally found themselves praying for characters in their favorite novels and books and movies because they have forgotten. Because these stories have become part of who they are. Moses expects the next generation to live and act as though they had been there at the mountain. And we are to live as though we witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. Words become the source of Israel's ongoing experience with God. See, if they will listen and if they will do, words become the primary way by which God makes himself known to these people. And what Israel does with God's words then actually dictate how Israel will experience God into the future. Last week, our passage urged us to flip our script. While we tend to look longingly on the past and critically of the present, Moses urged us to critique our past and see God's faithfulness in the present. This week, we need more script flipping. We demand experiences with God. We might not put it in those terms, but we expect them. We long for them. We hunger for them. And so that then we can trust him and live obediently because he has met us in these ways that we think he should. But the second generation in the wilderness doesn't get such an experience. They get to receive the first generation's experience as their own. And depending on what they do with it, they will either experience God's gracious presence in the promised land, or they will experience God's just jealousy. We too don't get the experience of sitting with the resurrected Jesus as he teaches. We don't get the experience of eating with the one that we had seen crucified and is now alive and in the flesh with wounds that can be touched. But Paul tells us in Philippians that when we trust Jesus and follow his commands, when we enter into his suffering obediently, we know God and we experience here and now the power of his resurrection. Experience, it seems, follows trust. I wonder what would happen if we stopped looking for signs and wonders and experienced and instead started to really enjoy, find deep and abiding joy in what we've already been given. We've been given God's words that tell us stories about God's actions and about God's character, words that call us to trust this God with our lives, words that instruct us on how to demonstrate that trust as we live, as we are in relationship, as we work, as we go to school, as we worship. The question that every generation faces is whether we are going to create for ourselves empty experiences that we name as God, but are really something we've manufactured, or whether we will create a lifeless God Because our God needs a face, our God needs to be seen. Whether we will do these things, or will each generation receive the life-giving words that God has given to us so that we might know, experience, and trust him as we meet with him in these words, trusting that they are his words and that they have the power to transform us. This is, I think, the invitation that our text invites us to this morning. Will we listen as God speaks? And will we respond as he commands?